Well, thank you all for showing up to pay attention to material which will not be on today's midterm, but is of course still rather important and of course will be on the quiz, which we're going to have shortly after the spring break. Basically what I'm going to do today, I'm going to split the lecture in two. The first half we're going to look at the Cold War in Europe, and in the second half the onset of the Cold War in Asia. Europe being certainly where the Cold War originated, logically enough, after all. It did originate as a cleavage in the Western world, as opposed to Asia. It spilt over into Asia with the spread of American and, of course, Soviet power there. But the question, again, sometimes you ask about the origins of the Cold War and how it all started. It's not really that surprising, of course, when you really think about it. And in a sense, you could say the Cold War began the creation of, well, communist Russia back in, of course, 1918, 1919. There was a civil war there in which the Western powers intervened. There was always a kind of level of rhetorical war in the sense that Lenin was always denouncing the bourgeois capitalist world, as did Stalin. And for the most part, this enmity had actually endured in the 20s and 30s. It's just there had been this, you might say, almost anomalous period between 1941 and 1945 when, on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the West had, of course, befriended Stalin as they needed his help to defeat Hitler. You might say then naturally things tended back in the opposite direction. Well, I think all of that is true in the logical, even political or ideological sense. But here's the thing. We can take it as a given that Stalin and the Soviet Union, so long as it was ruled by communists, were hostile to the Western world. That was basically a given. I think the real question is, when did the Americans decide that they wanted to fight back? Honestly, I don't think it's that much more complicated than that. Stalin, after all, had made his intentions perfectly clear long before the Second World War, with his creation, of course, of the International Communist Network. Well, the Comintern, the Communist International, was created under Lenin. Stalin had sort of pushed it to the side a little bit from the mid-30s onward, and instead had used primarily the forces of essentially espionage, turning a place like Spain into a killing ground for his political enemies. Global rhetoric against Trotskyists. Of course, the same rhetoric, or at least a slightly different rhetoric, against capitalists. Stalin then, of course, in the process of defeating Hitler, had brought his own brand of totalitarianism into Europe. We had in Poland an episode I mentioned the other day when the Red Army pulled up short of Warsaw to enable the Germans to crush the Polish Home Army, killing about 15,000 armed soldiers and another 100,000 civilians, while the Red Army simply looked on. And that was because, of course, Stalin did not want the Polish Home Army under Komorowski to liberate Poland, because then they might have actually been independent of Soviet influence. A similar problem did actually emerge. You could say Stalin maybe had a logical point there. We'll look a little bit later in today's lecture at Yugoslavia, with, of course, Marshal Tito, who, because his own partisans did largely chase out, the Nazis and their satellites and allies from Yugoslavia, they were able to have a certain independence from Stalin. So he was not wrong in political logic. Meanwhile, of course, his troops, as they poured into Germany, they showed, shall we say, their rather brutal intentions. The number you usually see bandied about by scholars today is that Soviet soldiers raped about 2 or 3 million women. That's a lot of women. No one was counting, of course. But as Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself, famed author of the Gulag Archipelago, trilogy of novels set in the First World War, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, etc. As he said himself, it was basically assumed. I actually have the quote here. Let's see if I can get it right. He said that it was basically known that if the girls that we found were German, they could be raped and then shot if you wanted. This was almost a combat distinction, he said. Now, one can say that the vengeance enacted upon the Germans was, of course, in part justified, at least in the kind of temperamental sense that the Germans had waged a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. But the Soviet actions were not confined to simply enacting vengeance upon the women of Germany. They also literally looted Germany of its factories. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. They just literally carted the factories back to Russia. Carthaginian vengeance, you might call it. Although, curiously enough, they eventually did, of course, embrace East Germany in reaction to West Germany and allow it to become something like a semi-independent satellite of the Soviet Union. At least in the early days, the Soviets made no secret of the fact that their intentions towards the Germans were, shall we say, bestial, if not brutish. Their intentions towards the Poles were not a whole lot nicer. They were a little bit nicer to the Czechs, but that's partly because the Czechs just kind of sat out the Second World War. That's part of the reason that Prague, of course, kind of emerges unscathed. But here's the thing. Stalin didn't have a whole lot to worry about. At the Yalta Conference, curiously enough, in fact, shortly after the Yalta Conference, after this deal I talked about, where FDR said, okay, please do at least have elections in Poland, but we're not going to actually insist on having observers there, so you can kind of do it the way you want. In addition to this, FDR bizarrely makes a public announcement that the US would withdraw all of its troops from Europe within 2 years. Which was, of course, exactly what Stalin wanted to hear. It meant he could carry out whatever campaigns that he wanted in Europe. Vengeance against the Germans, satellites in Eastern Europe, eventually, presumably, some kind of coups d'etats in maybe even France and Italy where the communists were active in the resistance. It looked pretty good for Stalin and the Soviet Union and the communist cause generally. Communist prestige, of course, was in the stratosphere because everyone basically knew that the Soviets had been the ones who really defeated Hitler. No matter what the people in the West said about how they had helped to arm the Soviet Union, how the Americans had sent all of these trucks and Studebakers and spam, that was all true, even though they didn't publicize it, rather strangely. The Soviets still did the vast bulk of the fighting and the dying, so their prestige was immense. The Americans, yes, in the strategic and even economic sense, were the real beneficiaries of the Second World War. However, the precedent from the First World War suggested that they were probably going to go home and maybe even forfeit their victory. I mean, famously, of course, in the First World War, America sent 4 million troops, doughboys as they were called, because, you know, they were so well fed and their cheeks looked like sort of like bread dough. Well, anyway, they sent over 4 million doughboys, and then they brought them right back home. And now FDR has promised to do the exact same thing again. So the Americans, that is, were planning on disengaging. FDR was planning on disengaging. Some of FDR's advisors, in fact, the former Vice President Henry Wallace, even suggested that America should unilaterally disarm. That is, not just withdraw its troops, but actually stop spending on the military. That America should retreat back into its kind of shell of isolationism. There was always a strain of this sort of thinking in America that, you know, the affairs of Europe were wicked and the Americans had escaped from all the problems of the old world, and now that they had solved them, they should go home and go back to their own business. You remember the slogan in the 20s, the business of America was business. There was a lot of expectation that this would happen again. In fact, George Kennan, he's mostly known, particularly in this context, as the author of first the so-called long telegram from Moscow warning about Soviet intentions, and then later the so-called X article published in Foreign Affairs, which I wrote there. I'll talk about Kennan and his doctrine in a moment. But even before this, Kennan had worked out a kind of way of explaining the Americans and the way they interacted with the world. His metaphor was that of the dragon. You know, the dragon who basically kind of hoards his treasure. Like, you know what a dragon is, I assume, right? You know, they breathe fire. You sort of like, you hoard your treasure. You know, you're rich and you're, you know, fat and you're well-fed and you're very powerful. And most of the time, you just want to be left alone so you can enjoy your buried treasure. And every so often, you snort up some smoke. But you basically keep to yourself. Now, it's true that, you know, like if you're in the kind of Lord of the Rings mentality, you know, maybe like the orcs or possibly the elves or the dwarves, they might come and prod you a little bit. You know, kind of like test your defenses. And you might sort of shake them to the side. You might even get a little bit angry and breathe a little bit of fire. But for the most part, you're bigger than they are, and so you don't really care. If they ever really do get you angry, though, like let's say, like the elves and the dwarves team up, you know, and they not only prod you a little bit, but like they actually poke you with a sword and they start attacking you from 2 sides. Or let's say the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Then the dragon is really alive and angry, and he roars in all directions. A little bit like, if you remember Team America, was it, the South Park movie? World Police. It's rather funny. The idea is like the Americans go out on this mission and accidentally they blow up the Eiffel Tower and all this other kind of funny stuff. That's sort of like the idea. The Americans in the Second World War, they build not only the world's largest arsenal, building hundreds, literally hundreds of aircraft carriers, tens of thousands of heavy bombers. They produced this colossal effort in 4 years, the world's first operational atomic weapon, because they had 4 separate factories working on the project. They dropped 2 nukes on Japan. They firebombed Tokyo, Dresden, German cities from the air. The wrath, the fury of the dragon has been unleashed. And then the dragon goes back to sleep. At least that was sort of the expectation. And that's what Kennan said to describe the Americans and the way they kind of interacted with the world. Churchill, incidentally. Churchill, you sometimes hear just this, Churchill was sort of an Americanophile and he loved the Americans, and it's true that his wife was like half American and he spent a lot of time in America, and all of that is true. But he never really trusted the Americans. He certainly didn't trust FDR, and for very good reason. Churchill's metaphor was that America was kind of like this gigantic barge. It was like a huge ship in the ocean, but possibly not even in the ocean so much as like in a small channel. A very powerful barge, where if you knew how to steer it, you could get the goods to the right place, keep the trains moving on time, accomplish great things. But if the barge were just left adrift alone, it would sort of like block all of the traffic and nothing would get done. But that the British needed to figure out how to steer that American barge into the ship. Churchill's idea was, again, rooted in, I think, a pretty keen understanding of the dilemmas and even the kind of curious obsessions of American politics. It wasn't just that, Americans were a little bit provincial and many of them didn't travel, and famously, members of Congress even today, many of them don't even have passports and they don't travel. That was part of it, kind of isolationism and provincialism. A lot of it, though, too, was the problem of politics in a multi-ethnic democracy, where you have all of these different interest groups vying for attention. Like you hear today a lot about, let's say, the Armenian lobby and how they want the genocide resolution. Or you hear about the Greek lobby and how they don't want certain technologies to be transferred to the Turkish army. That's what you might hear about in this country. In another country, you might hear about something different. You might hear about the Cuban lobby, which runs Florida. You might hear about, let's say, the Poles, and the fact that the Poles, through all of this, are exercising, great influence in American politics. The Japanese, who not so much influential, they're almost like negatively influential because they were so resented inside America that there were a lot of Americans who were anti-Japanese. And then curiously, the Chinese were seen by a lot of Americans much more favorably than the Japanese. I think that was in part because most of the Chinese who came to America, tended to work in servile occupations. They weren't competing for the top jobs in the way the Japanese were. So Churchill realized you had to reckon with all of this too. Different lobby groups, oftentimes at loggerheads with one another with their ways of trying to manipulate the American political system. In different ways, which made it rather difficult for any kind of coherent policy doctrine to emerge. And the fact that Americans also, partly because they were a little bit provincial, you remember my comment about, the Bulgarian ambassador says, well, we are now at war with your country, and supposedly White House spokesman says, yes, and where exactly is Bulgaria? Whether or not that story is true, it did capture something of the essence of America's peculiar relationship with the world, of both being, in a sense, the center of the world, because its economy is the consumer of last resort. And in that era was even the investor of last resort. But then Americans who, for the most part, were more or less happy to tend their own affairs. Now, America, after the Second World War, inherited the British Empire, you might say accidentally, without really planning to, and in some ways without really even wanting to. Anyway, the story of the first half of today's lecture is in a way how the British curiously convinced the Americans to inherit their empire against their own will, in an odd way. America, remember, as I have said, had promised to go home. FDR had no plans to stick around in Europe and fight some sort of quote-unquote Cold War, as we later called it, with the Russians. In fact, FDR really liked Stalin. Partly because he got a lot of bad advice from his advisors, and partly because, frankly, he was a little bit naive. American propaganda during the war, they went so far as to turn Stalin into this sort of like, likable personality, puffing his cigar. And it was Churchill with his cigars. It was his pipe, supposedly. He had his peepo, and he would like puff his pipe and smile his kind of fatherly smile, sort of like, your favorite old uncle. That's what they called him. They called him Uncle Joe. They created this image, that he was like a regular guy that Americans could get along with. He wasn't the mass murderer responsible for the deaths of millions of people, who had had most of his own aides and lieutenants and generals and so on murdered in the 1930s. No. He was Uncle Joe Stalin. Now, as FDR put it at one point to Churchill, he said that he didn't want Churchill even to bother negotiating with Stalin because he said, he likes me better. Well, I'm sure Stalin was happy to encourage this idea. Part of it was also that FDR, just because he was prey to so many fashionable ideas, he was typically American in some ways, atypically American in others. A way in which he was typically American, though, was that he was anti-imperialist. That's something that might seem ironic today, but America, of course, was born in a kind of anti-colonial war against Great Britain, so that it's always been a part of America's kind of mythological self-image that America doesn't support empire and imperialism. And in fact, that was politically true of most Americans at this time. Britain and France after the war were in this curious position of both being grateful to the Americans for basically helping save them from the Nazis, but also terrified that the Americans would now tear apart their empires, which they could no longer really afford to maintain on their own. As it turned out, America was somewhat ambivalent. They ended up sort of helping to prop up the French in Indochina and Vietnam for a while, but even that was only because eventually they were convinced that it was in their own national interest to do so. They had no love for the British Empire, at least in the sense of literally controlling these territories. They had no desire to help Britain prop up its empire. And as we're going to see actually next week, when it came to basically the crunch moment, the Suez Crisis of 1956, America sold out Britain and France. Basically, they sold them down the river. So the Americans did not like imperialism. As FDR put it another time to Churchill, he didn't think Churchill understood Stalin because he said, you as a Brit, you have hundreds of years of acquisitive instinct in your blood. You might not understand how someone like Stalin didn't really want to conquer territory. That's what he thought. As he put it, I think even more devastatingly, he tells Churchill this: if I give Stalin everything I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, as a sort of aristocrat, then Stalin won't try to annex any territory and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace. This is actually how FDR viewed Stalin. He had no intention of confronting him, none. He wanted to give Stalin whatever he wanted. Now, this was not just an idea. In practice, here's what it meant. Beginning even before the war was over, the summer of 1944, after D-Day, the Americans and the Brits, they break through German lines, mostly in France, along with parts of Belgium. They haven't quite made it to the Rhine River yet in Germany. But basically, the Rhine is just a couple of days away. They could have very easily pushed onto the Rhine, pushed on into Germany. Probably by the fall of 1944, they could have been in Munich and Berlin. And then possibly by spring of 1945, they could have been in places like Prague. They probably wouldn't have made it to Warsaw before the Soviets, but they very easily could have rolled up a good deal of southeastern Europe, where the Soviets were actually much weaker, not even having troops in Yugoslavia. They could have cut the Soviets off from the Balkans, essentially made sure that almost all of Europe, except for probably Poland, because the Russians were already there, were in Western hands. They didn't do that. They ordered the army simply to stop. Why? Well, as Eisenhower, who as an American was of course given the supreme command, the overall command of the Allied armies, as Eisenhower put it, but of course he's also getting orders from Roosevelt, I would be loath to risk American lives for political purposes. An admirable sentiment, but rather a naive one. The idea again being that you have tactics and you have strategy. We are trying to defeat the common enemy, the Germans, which supposedly doesn't dictate that we're in any particular rush to get into Germany. That, for example, Berlin, if the Americans wanted to conquer it, it's true, they would have had to sacrifice many troops. Probably they would have lost, let's say, maybe 100,000 more than they actually did lose if they had pushed on more quickly into Germany. Now, who knows what would have happened? Maybe they would have lost more, maybe less. But yes, they would have lost more men. And so it made a kind of sense. Eisenhower, as a kind of cautious commander, basically did not want to risk too many lives. This is not a problem Stalin had, incidentally. Remember, the Red Army lost over 20 million men in the Second World War. But of course, they gained a lot for that loss. In the end, they basically gained an Eastern European empire. The Americans just didn't want to do that. They didn't want it to turn into a race. They didn't want to have a competition. There were other ways, though, in which this manifested itself. I talked about how the British, Churchill initially, not so much out of naivete, but almost out of a kind of peculiar impulse, had sent these 200 planes that were supposed to reinforce Singapore to the Soviet Union instead. Then the Americans had sent massive amounts of aid to the Soviet Union. The Soviets had actually denied, for the most part, that this was taking place, like in their official state media. The West also shared key strategic information. Enigma, which you might watch the movie, Enigma, basically the decoding of the British Enigma codes allowed the British to follow almost everything that the Russians were doing on the Eastern Front. I'm sorry, that the Germans were doing on the Eastern Front. They also shared, I didn't talk much about this yet, but the subject of the Katyn Forest massacre. This is when the Soviets had killed about 15,000 Polish military officers back in 1940. It was a big rallying cry during the Cold War for Polish nationalists and anti-communists, because the official communist line was that they had been killed in 1941. That is, after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, such that the Germans must have killed them. We now know, and the Soviet Union, well, eventually, I mean, even Gorbachev and then Yeltsin even took responsibility for the massacre, so we now know the truth, although we kind of knew it all along, that no, they were killed in 1940, they were killed by the NKVD and the Red Army. Now, the British codebreakers actually learned about this information. I don't want to give away the plot of the movie, it's involved with the plot, but basically they decided not to publicize it because they didn't want to hurt the Allied cause. Meanwhile, they shared every scrap of information that they could with the Soviets regarding, again, German troop movements, materiel, logistics, etc. The Soviets gave them nothing in return. The Soviets, at one point, late in 1944, they actually, they swept up a German submarine base, up on the Baltic at Gdynia, kind of in what is now Poland. They had all kinds of code books that they discovered, which they could have shared with the Western allies, who were still sending these convoys across the Atlantic Ocean, convoys which were actually supplying the Russians. But the Russians didn't want to share the information, and so they didn't. Now, by 1944, Churchill knew all of this. FDR obviously did not. FDR still thought that Uncle Joe Stalin was his friend. So Churchill, no longer trusting FDR and basically his better judgment, decided that he should try to kind of negotiate a little bit with Stalin on his own. This was the origin of the so-called naughty document of October 1944. Basically the idea was this. Churchill was going to try to act as if he were FDR because FDR was not actually being the American president, or he was not really serving American or Western interests. So he proposed to Stalin that they would kind of horse trade over the fate of Eastern Europe. Basically, the Brits wanted Greece because they already had troops there, and because Greece, of course, basically as a country, a Mediterranean littoral country, was strategically important for the British Navy, close to Suez. In exchange for Greece, they were willing to concede Stalin domination of places like Yugoslavia and Hungary, although Churchill wanted it to be more like 50-50, as he put it. Bulgaria and Romania, he conceded to Stalin, but he wanted some kind of Western input in Hungary and Yugoslavia, and he wanted Western dominance in Greece. Stalin, realizing that he had sort of met his match as far as cynicism and bargaining, and Stalin actually signed off on this document with Churchill. The story at the Yalta Conference was, of course, quite different. FDR did not back up any of these unofficial claims that Churchill had made, although by this point Greece had more or less fallen into the Western sphere, not accidentally. A civil war broke out in Athens that winter, which some people say was actually the sort of opening shot in the Cold War, where the communists, rise up. Britain, having troops on the ground, was able to help the kind of nationalist forces defeat the communists there. But at Yalta, Poland wasn't the only issue. It was the key issue. It was a symbolic issue. And for many good reasons. I mean, Poland, after all, was supposedly what the war was about. Poland was the casus belli for Britain and France back in 1939. Maybe it wasn't a very sensible casus belli. Maybe they should have fought over Czechoslovakia in 1938. But they had fought over Poland. And so the Brits were rather shocked that FDR kind of so naively just gave Stalin what he wanted in Poland. Yes, it's true that the Soviet delegation made various vague promises. Yes, we'll hold elections and we will try to, pay attention to some of your concerns, etc., etc., etc. In March 1945, shortly after Yalta, Molotov, basically realizing he had FDR in his pocket, just sort of announced, we're going to go ahead and hold the elections, no observers, we're going to do the whole thing, the way we do it in Eastern Europe. And he basically did not offer the Americans any role at all, even as observers or liaisons in the elections. It's curious that this announcement is what finally caused FDR, you might say, to see the light. He supposedly mumbled something in early, I think it was about the 12th of April. He said that either Stalin is not really in charge of the Politburo or he's not a man of his word. So he finally realized that Stalin was not the best friend that he had thought he was. And shortly after he came to this realization, he died. So American foreign policy was now freed from the clutches of FDR and his naive illusions about the world. So that was the first key development in a sense. In fact, there's a certain school of revisionism among American historians. The people who were a little more sympathetic to the communists, and they sort of blame the Cold War on Truman, and they say if only FDR had lived, there might not have been a Cold War. I think it's more accurate to say that if only FDR had lived, there wouldn't have been a Cold War because Stalin would have won it. Stalin would have essentially carved up most of Western Europe. The communists were already very influential in France and Italy. They were polling very high politically, again, because of the prestige of the Soviet armies and so on. There was a very good chance, that is, that the communists would have controlled all of Europe within a couple of years. FDR, after all, had promised, remember, to send the troops home. Now, Truman was a different sort of man. Truman, in a way, was an accident, first of all, that he'd even become vice president. Henry Wallace had been vice president from 1940 to 44. FDR then was on his third term. In 1944, he was elected to a fourth term, entirely unprecedented in American history. He's the only president to serve more than 2 terms. So that to a certain extent, he's almost the closest thing America ever really had to a kind of tyrant or dictator or monarch. He put Truman in, as usual, for political reasons. Truman was from the Midwest. He was trying to shore up his coalition there. He was from the state of Missouri. He was a fairly inexperienced senator. He hadn't really even been in Washington for very long. But partly for that reason, he was not prey to the usual fashions and illusions of Washington. He was kind of just an old-fashioned middle American. A little bit like Eisenhower, who was from Iowa, only as it turned out, he was in some ways even tougher than Eisenhower. He actually called Molotov in to berate him for what the Soviets were doing in Poland. He just started lecturing him. And Molotov was actually shaken by this. He went out and he told the press, there's this famous quote. He said something like, "I've never been talked to like that in my life." And then Truman goes to the press and he said, "Well, if you had carried out your agreements, then you wouldn't get talked to like that." Truman was also, there was an interesting thing about him, like some of the biographers, they note that there was a certain difference also in psychology between the Americans and the Russians, like looking at, different ways they approached diplomacy in the Cold War. Russians, of course, famously like to play chess, and they're very good at it. They're very good at the kind of slow-moving chessboard of international diplomacy and, picking out a piece and figuring out how it relates to another piece. Truman didn't play chess. He played poker. And so Truman was all about, you might say, the bluff. Or at the very least, he was about blustering and kind of talking tough in order to, shall we say, let the other side that he couldn't be rolled over. He wouldn't necessarily reveal his hand. He had supposedly a good poker face. He beat Churchill once famously. He won like $75 from Churchill, and Churchill claimed that he let Truman win in order to, get the Americans to commit their forces to Europe. Well, anyway, there are a lot of legends about this period, but the basic transition is not that complicated. You go from FDR to Truman. This begins to kind of toughen up the American attitude towards Stalin. There's even a difference between Yalta and then the conference later that summer at Potsdam. Potsdam, I didn't write it on the board because in some ways the decisions there weren't that important. Most of the key business was done at Yalta. At Potsdam, they talked about whether the Russians were going to join the war against Japan, which remember they did right after the atomic bombs were dropped. It was also literally at Potsdam that the Americans learned that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested. And so there was a lot of drama behind the scenes when the Americans get this news, and they share it rather vaguely with the Russians. We have just tested out a weapon of new power and all of this. And Stalin, realizing what this means, immediately gives Lavrenti Beria, the former secret police chief, sweeping powers, essentially superior to that of any other official in the Soviet Union as far as appropriation of resources and men to, of course, crash start the Soviet's own nuclear program. So the atmosphere at Potsdam is already fairly tense. And that's by the summer of 1945. In 1946, a couple of kind of key things happen in succession. Stalin is, I think the metaphor you might use to talk about like cards, he's sort of like overplaying his hand a little bit. Stalin is supposed to, according to Yalta and Potsdam, withdraw troops from Iran, where the Soviets, they never completely withdrew their troops from there. He's supposed to set, basically this kind of like timeline of withdrawal. He misses it. He starts making adamant demands about Turkey. He wants back the Elviye Selassie, those provinces they had won in the 1877 war, particularly Kars and Ardahan. He, of course, makes a big play for the Straits. He wants to overturn the Montreux Convention, basically meaning this was the updated version of the old Straits Conventions of the 19th century, limiting access for Russian warships to the Boaz, the Bosporus, and of course Çanakkale, and so on, the Dardanelles, the Straits as we call them. So Stalin is now making all kinds of demands. News kind of also comes in at about the same time of the way the Red Armies and their troops and Soviet agents are kind of behaving in Eastern Europe. Supposedly, like in Belgrade, they're arresting anyone seen in the company of Americans and Britons. There's a massacre of about 20,000 anti-communists in Bulgaria. There are rumors swirling around about a putsch in Italy. Generally speaking, the word is kind of out that the Soviets are taking over Eastern Europe and they're taking no prisoners. They haven't taken over everything yet. Like Czechoslovakia is still semi-independent. Poland has pretty much already been rolled into the Soviet sphere, and Yugoslavia, it's kind of like could go either way. They're not sure about Tito, whether Stalin controls him. But basically, they're making these moves. Not subtle, aggressive, and this is what I think finally awakens the Americans. With a little bit of help, remember, from Churchill. First he loses money at poker to Truman, to get Truman supposedly to get more engaged. But no, he of course famously gives his Iron Curtain speech, which really was, I think, one of the immortal speeches of the 20th century, not just because it was eloquent and had a political point and so on, but because it was very expressly aimed at the Americans. The speech was actually given in America, in Belton, Missouri, which was Truman's home state. So there was a little bit of a sort of almost an egging on of Truman, trying to kind of almost shame him into acting. As Churchill put it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, talking about Soviet domination, etc., etc., all these ancient capitals. They were all now being swept up in the gray, sort of depressing likeness of communism, totalitarianism, secret police. He exaggerated a little bit. Not all of these countries really had been rolled up by the communists yet. But by exaggerating the point for effect, he helped to put the pressure on on Truman. Now, Truman, if it had just been up to him himself, he probably would have acted even sooner. In fact, one of the things he did have the authority to do as president was to kind of reshuffle the intelligence agencies. The OSS, the Organization of Strategic Services was, of course, transformed famously into the CIA. This was about really almost directly following Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in the summer of 1946. Truman even got into the spirit of it. You know, they had like a meeting where they all put on these like black hats and played cloak and dagger and all of this. You know, so the U.S. now had a permanent standing spy agency, which, I cannot emphasize this enough, was unprecedented in American history. I mean, they never had anything really like that before. They had the OSS in the Second World War, but it was supposed to be more like, you know, counterintelligence and paramilitary operations. This was now a permanent spy establishment. So Truman was already taking moves on his own. But remember that in American foreign policy, the president's authority is limited. People forget this right up to the present day. In fact, President Obama seems to have forgotten it several weeks ago when he authorized, of course, the use of force in Libya without even consulting the Congress, which was astonishing unless we remember that Truman launched the Korean War also without consulting Congress, also while going through the United Nations instead of Congress. All of which is simply, there's no other way of describing it, unconstitutional. It's not in the Constitution. Congress has the authority to declare war. The president does not. So Truman's ability was limited. To win over Congress, you needed something a bit stronger than just personal diplomacy, like Churchill leaning on Truman. You needed a real crisis, something which the president could use to go before Congress and get Congress to put up the money, to pony up the dough, that is, to support the new security architecture. Because remember, America had begun withdrawing its troops. America had withdrawn its troops really mostly from Europe and even from Asia. They only had a few tens of thousands of soldiers left on the Asian mainland. In Europe, they had a bit more than that in the occupation zone of West Germany. But they had nothing like the army of 10 million men they had had at the end of the war. So Truman, his hands are not tied exactly, but he was not able simply to declare that America will now make these security guarantees to Europe. Remember, security guarantees the Americans had expressly not made after the First World War. They had not guaranteed French security. They had not joined the League of Nations. They had not erected any kind of security alliance infrastructure. And Truman still was not quite able to do this. The thing which finally seems to have tipped things over the edge was, as the story usually goes, and it's mostly true, that the British more or less folded. The British finally just informed the Americans that they were broke and they could not afford their security commitments. It was not entirely an exaggeration. I mean, they were broke in the sense that it wasn't just that the Americans, under the terms of Lend-Lease, had leased all of these arms to Britain for which Britain had to pay in terms of things like basing rights. Britain, of course, had financed the war again by deficit expenditure. They owed billions of dollars to the Americans. The dollar was now, of course, the supreme currency everywhere. The British didn't have enough dollars. In fact, when the British finally did get the Americans to send them aid, like under the Marshall Plan, they mostly used the dollars just to pay their debts to the Americans. They didn't really even get to spend them in England. Britain was suffering really badly too. Some of it was also because this kind of historic winter of 1946 to 47 was the coldest winter for generations. I mean, this was even more true in Europe, where in Germany, I mean, no one really cared about the Germans at this point. I mean, the Germans, the way they suffered after the Second World War almost makes you feel sorry for them. It's true, they had inflicted vast suffering during the war. But no less than 13 million Germans were cleansed from their home. In fact, Czechoslovakia just literally expelled them all. Virtually every German from Czechoslovakia. They called these the Beneš decrees. You might want to remember that phrase, not necessarily because I'm going to test you on it, but because it gives a kind of legal precedent for the expulsion of ethnic minorities, which certain European governments might try to invoke at some point in the future. One wonders. They were used to expel Germans. The Germans, meanwhile, their country is in ruins because of the bombing. They're just pretty much starving. This winter, a lot of them just freeze to death. In Britain, it was what they called a catastrophe of ice and snow. They're still on wartime rationing. One of the few things which kept the British from completely hating the Americans was that the Americans did at least send a lot of cigarettes. They also sent care packages. I've got a personal experience of this in that my mother's family is of German descent, and her father, my grandfather, actually sent these kind of care package parcels, to Germans after the war who were destitute. And one of these families, they became like pen pals, and so several generations we got to go visit them in Germany. Although interestingly, they went from being destitute and dirt poor in 1946. By the time my mother went to visit them in the late 1960s, Wirtschaftswunder, they were, of course, prosperous. By the time I visited them in like the early 1990s, they were all retired and traveling the world. They were rich, basically. But in 1946, they had nothing. So, Germany's starving. France and Italy are, again, suffering almost as badly as the Germans. The communists are making inroads in terms of politics. The British, they've run out of dollars. They just basically can't afford anything. And meanwhile, Britain now has not just as large an empire as it did before, but it has all these new commitments that it just cannot afford. It's paying out all this money to places like Palestine. Of course, Greece and Turkey, the commitment they were paying annually to support, the nationalist side in Greece was about $340 million. Remember, they're running out of dollars. Palestine, for the occupation there, they're paying about $330 million. Even in Turkey, just essentially to prop up the government and ward off the Soviet advance, they're paying almost $400 million a year. They simply tell the Americans, we're broke, we cannot afford it. This is February 1947. They're broke, they're suffering from this catastrophic winter. They pretty much just punt. They say, like, we give up. Our empire's yours if you want it. But you're going to have to pay. And the Americans, of course, famously decide, okay, well, this is the moment. They don't just decide it, though. Truman, remember, was already pretty much convinced. It's this crisis which gives Truman, you might say, the courage, the kind of atmosphere of necessity, of desperate, dire straits and need to go before Congress and finally announce what will become known as the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine, there is a kind of eloquence to it. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, to assist free peoples. Now, obviously that can be variously interpreted, and in the end it largely meant America would prop up governments who were anti-communist, whatever sort of internal affairs they practiced. So there was an ideological bent to it, which was not always warranted by circumstances. But at least in this case, it kind of did make sense. The Greeks, the Italians, the French were all basically under threat of possibly falling under communist rule. In the Turkish case, it's not that the communists were that strong. It's just that Turkey, being so close to the Soviet Union, could, of course, have very easily been invaded or simply pressured by the Soviets. We take it for granted now that Turkey did not go that way in the Cold War. But if you compare Turkey to another country in a similar geographical position, Finland, well, it's quite interesting, because the Finns, it's not that they were necessarily communist in the Cold War. They weren't. But they had no independent foreign policy. They had to do whatever the Soviets said. Basically, the threat was, we'll invade you and crush you if you ever misbehave. A little bit like the British did in Afghanistan in the 19th century. The worst part about it for the Finns was that the main thing they really had to do in practical terms was every time some Russian would try to cross the border, that is to basically flee the Soviet Union, the Finns had to give them back. After which they would usually be sent to mental hospitals. But anyway, so Turkey becomes an important part of the security architecture, largely because of its geographical position. Strategic location, in addition to, even places like Sinop. It's so close to the Soviet Union, the Americans used it as a listening post. The Americans, of course, famously base, these missiles in Turkey, which, because, they're shorter range, they're actually able to reach the Soviet Union, before America had its vast arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles. But in the short run, it's mostly economic aid. The Americans turn over, just in the first year or so, it's a couple $100 million, about $150, $200 million, just to prop up the kind of Turkish military security architecture. A few years later, Turkey will, of course, also be enrolled in the Marshall Plan, under which Turkey will get another $300 million or so. So Turkey is then kind of brought into the security architecture of the West. Now, the Americans, it's not that they have yet committed that much of their own troops to Western Europe, but you might say that that was implicit in the Truman Doctrine to begin with. Because as I have said, in both France and Italy, the communists were doing extremely well in the polls, and there was a realistic fear that they might even come to power through the ballot box. And so there, it's like the CIA first that gets involved, somewhat controversially. I mean, it's funny that later on, the kind of anti-communist Americans would criticize the CIA for its involvement. And they definitely did a lot of things in the Cold War that probably Americans regret. But when it comes to France and Italy in 1947-48, it's hard to fault them. After all, what did they do? Well, yes, they supported certain politicians and newspapers and journals and so on in order to keep the communists from coming to power. And thus today, France and Italy are the #1 and the #2 tourist destinations in the world, instead of being bleak, gray, totalitarian carcasses like the countries in Eastern Europe, of course, ruled by the communists. Turkey, incidentally, is in 8th place, but rising in terms of tourist income. Well, anyway, so the Americans, they begin informally at first, making these commitments to places like Greece and Turkey under the Truman Doctrine. Then they start getting involved in Western European politics, in France and Italy. A lot of this stuff, I think the thing which really kind of set Stalin over the edge in terms of like him getting angry at the Americans was probably the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan was first announced at the commencement, that is the graduation address at Harvard University by George Marshall in June of 1947. The money didn't start flowing until a bit over a year later in July 1948. Now, there are a couple of ways of looking at the Marshall Plan. In the early days, it was just celebrated, as great American benevolence and generosity. They send over, depending on the figures, I've seen $10 billion, $13 billion within a couple of years to Europe, almost as a gift, kind of. Yes, there were strings attached. This is the same way that the World Bank and the IMF work. If you give these loans, you kind of expect the money to do something which benefits you. And yes, the Americans got a lot of the contracts, and of course the Americans also sold a lot of goods to the Europeans, which they used this money to buy. I think probably the most accurate way of describing it is as an act of enlightened self-interest, which is to say it was absolutely a self-interested act, but a more far-sighted one than, let's say, the kind of things the Soviets were doing in Eastern Europe, which you might call unenlightened self-interest. That is, just taking factories and carting them back and sending them to the Soviet Union and reducing Germany to its state of privation. It is curious, though, we shouldn't exaggerate this. In the early days, the Americans were just as keen on punishing the Germans. The early security directives right after the war, they were even talking about, destroying Germany's industrial power forever and kind of turning the country into a, medieval agricultural sort of backwards country again. They changed their minds, a lot of it again just because of the Cold War, and they eventually decided to bring Germany, once they unified West Germany in early 1949, into the Western security infrastructure. It's a chicken or the egg thing. Was it Stalin's actions which provoked this? To some extent, they then provoked Stalin, of course, into counteractions, of which the most significant was, of course, the famous blockade of Berlin beginning in June of 1948. This is when Stalin simply surrounded Berlin. They didn't build the wall yet. That wasn't for another 13 years, but they cut off all the roads. Berlin, like originally all of Germany, was of course divided up into 4 zones, although in practice West Berlin had already become a kind of entity. The Allied zone, the French, British, American zone, had already become something like a kind of proto-version of what would become West Germany later, the Soviets in East Berlin. And the two sides of the city are starting to almost like solidify and harden into blocks. There isn't a wall yet, but there is already a huge gap in the standard of living and the style of administration and so on. In a way, Stalin, it was like he was playing poker. The question is who was bluffing, right? Was Stalin bluffing in cutting off Berlin, or eventually was Truman bluffing in supporting it? Now, interestingly, Stalin cut off the flow of all essential supplies, things like food and fuel and coal, thus you might say literally trying to starve the city. Although the one thing he didn't cut off, interestingly, was the water supply. Interesting question, why? You cut off the water supply, then there's really no turning back. The city would have had to surrender. So maybe Stalin still was holding something in reserve, in part because, look at the date, 1948, the Americans still had a nuclear monopoly. Now, this is something which you should keep in mind when you look at the early Cold War years. The Soviets, it's pretty simple. The Soviets have 2.5 million troops now occupying Eastern Europe. In addition to this, they have another 400,000 odd armed men of various types in the secret services, secret police, etc. So, long story short, they've got roughly 3 million men. Troops, secret policemen, etc. The Americans have not even maybe a couple 100,000, a bit more than 100,000 troops. So the Americans do not have the force to stand up to the Soviets. What they do have is the nuclear monopoly. Now, no one knew how big the arsenal was. They seem to have had about 12 bombs at this point. They do have a lot of heavy bombers with large range, and what they did is they fired up about 60 of them. The Americans, when the Berlin crisis began, Stalin blockading Berlin, they sent all of these heavy bombers over to Britain, which, amazingly, they didn't have there at the time. They had withdrawn everything after the Second World War. So in a way, this is the action which provokes the first American military response, that is, to the Soviets in Western Europe. And then, of course, they famously send in the airplanes, the airlift, the Luftbrücke, as the Germans called it, the Berlin airlift, where, every day they're sending in about 4,000 or 5,000 tons of food. They're dropping coal supplies to allow West Berlin, to survive. And there's a great propaganda value to it. It's like basically American air power is, helping to save the West Berliners. And they never completely forgot it. I mean, in the early 60s, after they built the Berlin Wall, when JFK goes there and he gives this great speech saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner," by which he meant to say, I'm a Berliner, but because of poor grammar, he actually said, I'm like a jelly donut, which is what a Berliner actually was. This is the joke that German teachers tell. It's rather silly. But yes, there was a lot of pro-American sentiment now in Berlin. A lot of interesting what-ifs here, though. Had Stalin cut off the water supply, had he gotten really serious, would the Americans have fought? There was discussion of the Americans trying to open the road in East Germany to Berlin. There was discussion of, possibly it even coming to blows. That is, of the Americans actually sending troops and fighting, backed up by their nuclear monopoly. Probably, thankfully for the people of Berlin and Germany, it didn't come to that. In the end, Stalin, he backed down. He did lift the blockade finally, although it was over a year later. It wasn't until 1949. In the meantime, though, a couple of the key developments in the early Cold War had already transpired. The Americans had put through the first sort of political maneuvers to turn West Germany into a sovereign state recognized by the Western powers. And of course, famously, the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO alliance, in April of 1949. So in the course of various provocations and possibly, you might say, tactical errors, Stalin had aroused the American dragon to the extent that the Americans were now committed to Europe. We shouldn't entirely exaggerate the commitment, though. The Americans still had not sent massive numbers of troops. They were still depending mostly on their nuclear monopoly and on their, in essence, you might call it again, it's a little bit like a poker bluff. That is, will we actually use those atomic weapons to thwart Soviet advances in Western Europe, or as Kennan put it, of course, in his doctrine, to contain the advance of the Soviet Union. The idea being that countries the Soviets already controlled were probably going to remain in the Soviet sphere, but that the Americans wanted to prevent further Soviet expansion. I'm just going to check the time briefly here. Yeah, we're through the first hour. Let's take a shortish break, about 5 or 10 minutes, and when we get back, we're going to look at the onset of the Cold War in Asia.